Thanks, guys. It's a great honour to be talking here today, and I think just like to congratulate you in the work that you've done and everything everyone has done to organise today's conference, and also to inspire, I think, many people like myself as well, that there is another way in terms of living in Ireland, but also globally, and the role in which housing plays in delivering a quality of life to the most vulnerable, but also to all of us, and the idea at the heart of it, which is community, and the values of solidarity and cooperation, which run through my motivation for engaging in what I do, but also I know for most people here that is why they're here today. In terms of my talk, I've framed it as human rights or financial speculative property, what role for housing in a republic. And it's a bit of a long-winded title, but I think it tried to capture what I want to talk about this morning, which is the role that housing plays in Ireland today. We live in a republic, supposed to be a republic, and I'll come on to that later. But I would argue, and I will show you in the analysis, and probably most of you are very well aware, that housing is not something that is a human right in Ireland, but it is a speculative commodity, and that is at the heart of the crisis of where we are today. And unless that changes, we're going to continue to see the most vulnerable, the most needy, those who need home as a right, to be excluded, to lose out. So just going to give you a bit of an outline and background of the housing situation in Ireland. Apologise to some of you who might know these facts and figures already and are very aware of it, but I know there's some people who mightn't be, so I'm going to try to give an overview and hopefully stimulate some thinking and continue to try and move in thinking about alternatives in terms of how we can deal with the housing issue. So these are some images from the housing crisis that exists at the moment in Ireland. They're from Dublin, and the reality is that's Jonathan Curry in the bottom right there, who you might be aware died on the streets outside the Dáil because he was homeless. We have families, and sometimes we see these images as people begging, but these are people who have been forced out of their homes, lost their homes for lots of different reasons, and the crisis can no longer be just seen as something that is affecting a small number of people. It is an emergency. It's not been taken serious enough. The figures now is that there's 1,000 children in Dublin living in emergency accommodation. That's various forms of hostels, hotels, and this is not the way we should be bringing up our children in this country, and I'll come on to that later again about what does it mean to live in a republic and what sort of republic did the people who founded this nation and this republic believe they were creating and what it is today. Just last night, I'm involved in a housing network which is trying to address the housing crisis in Dublin. One of the messages was there was a woman with a 6-month-old child wandering the streets in Ballymun trying to find accommodation because all the emergency accommodation was full. I think she was pregnant as well. The previous night, there was a message went around trying to find accommodation for a family who were living in a car with 2 children, 2 parents, and they were living in a car because there's no access to emergency accommodation. This is not just something that affects a small number of people. This crisis has gone beyond anything imaginable and anything that should be acceptable. In terms of some of the figures then, that's to show some of the human face of it. The figures then around, where has the crisis come from, and to understand the scale of it, we can see here there's almost 90,000 households in declared need of social housing in Ireland today. And that has almost doubled since 2008. And we see in 1996, it was less than 30,000. So something has clearly happened in this period of time. We had the housing boom, the Celtic Tiger, the greatest amount of wealth ever created in this country during that period. And we've had austerity, 5 years of austerity, banks been bailed out, and the resulting cost of a crisis that we can see there. Some of the figures in terms of the actual crisis and where it is affected, because there is a spatial dimension to all of this. This isn't a crisis that affects everybody equally. Just as housing doesn't affect everybody equally, there's different communities that are affected differently, more substantially than others. There's an injustice and an inequality in housing, reflecting the wider inequalities in society. But if we look at Dublin, has obviously got a very serious crisis in terms of the numbers. We have 30,000 on the waiting list between the four Dublin regions. We have rents increasing between 10 to 14%, even higher, over the last year. We look then Cork City, similarly 11,000 on the waiting list, rents increasing by 7%. Kildare, rents increasing by 15%. And what we see that it is in the cities, it is in the commuter belts around Dublin that this crisis is extending out of control. And at the heart of it is a number of factors. When we look at in terms of who's actually on the housing list, who is in need of housing, the majority of people are dependent on rent supplement. That means their income isn't sufficient to cover the cost of their accommodation, and they're receiving rent support from the state. That's called rent supplement. There's also a significant amount whose accommodation is unsuitable. And we have, of course, people who are with disabilities who are also on waiting lists requiring proper housing. Another issue is the time on waiting lists. We have 24,000 households who've been waiting over 4 years for local authority accommodation, for proper accommodation. And I was at a housing meeting last night speaking in Kildare, where a family spoke of they have 5 children, they're living in a rented accommodation, they've been on the housing waiting list for 10 years, so they're basically unemployed, they can't afford the accommodation. They were explaining that they've lived in 17 houses, because when you're on rent supplement, you're dependent on a landlord, and if the landlord decides that he wants to get rid of you, as with all private tenants in Ireland, they can give any number of reasons, and pretty quickly you have to leave. There's very few rights for tenants in Ireland, private tenants and social housing tenants. And so they've been forced to move around, and one of their children has special needs, and they just said that the impact on their children is incredible. This idea of moving around between homes, having no actual home, no stability, no place to build a community, not able to build a community, connections with friends. We have the mortgage arrears crisis. And you might have seen there in the housing waiting list that there was a tiny number of those who were mentioned about mortgages. Because a part of the problem is that the social housing, to qualify for social housing in Ireland, the limit, the threshold, income threshold is so low that very few people actually qualify for it. So we have this whole other category then of people in housing need, which is those who are in mortgage arrears and facing repossession. And this, of course, results from the housing boom and the crash, the financial crash, and also the way in which the Irish state decided to focus on bailing out the banks, bailing out developers, instead of addressing homeowners who are in crisis. And if we look at the mortgage arrears crisis, we see that we have reached the situation where over 100,000 people whose primary residence in their home are in mortgage arrears. That is, they're not keeping up with the payments on their mortgage. And while there's been claims in the last few and statements from the central bank and politicians over the last few months that the number in arrears is declining, which you can see up on the left-hand side that it is declining, but what is increasing is the proportion of people who are in long-term arrears. Those over 180 days significantly increasing. Those over 3 years in arrears has gone from 35,000 to 37,000 homeowners in arrears over almost 2.5 years. If we look then at the other area, which is buy-to-lets, that's people who bought an extra property or two properties during the housing boom. They're called buy-to-lets and they rent them out. We see there that there is almost, there's over 18,000 of those, 37,000 of those units in arrears, but significantly that's not changing at all. The number of buy-to-lets in arrears is continuing to remain static. It's not reducing. And Ireland in context then, if we look at our arrears, mortgage arrears problem as a percentage of the current mortgage balance in comparison to other countries like Italy, Greece, Portugal and Spain, which have been affected by the crisis, we see that our arrears problem is off the roof. This is a huge, huge problem comparatively. Now, some would argue that Spain does not have the same problem because they have repossessed the houses. They have repossessed over 100,000 homes in Spain. The question is that where we're heading in Ireland? And I believe it is in the current trajectory of policy. Spain was a housing crash as well. The repossessions per county, this is now what's in the process of going through the courts. There have been civil bills lodged. That's people who've received a letter to say that their house has been repossessed and it's entering the court system. We can see there's about 23,000 of those. And interestingly, again, we talk about manipulation of figures. The central bank has allowed the banks declare that if someone has entered the legal process of their home being repossessed, that they're allowed to calculate that as being their home restructured. And so we have this claim that all the mortgage crisis has been dealt with, when in actual fact, over half of people in arrears face their home being repossessed. And already 23,000 of these have entered the court cases, and we can see that's distributed across the country, but most particularly in Dublin, but also places like Kildare and Galway. And this is people who are going to lose their homes. So the question is, why did this happen? And there's many reasons for why this has happened and why we're in the situation we're in. But in particular, why we are where we are today is for three main reasons. The first has been the privatisation of social housing in Ireland. That's a trend that started in the 1980s, where local authorities reduced the amount of money that was being spent on social housing. It was following the Thatcherism principle of reducing, the state should reduce funding in things like public services. But the Irish state then started pursuing, and this had been started earlier, but it started to accelerate. It gave the surrender grant to local authority tenants, where if they gave up their home, they were given a grant to buy a unit, buy a housing unit elsewhere. This led to a huge decline in local authority estates, as those who could afford to left the local authority estates. And basically what was behind it was the ideology that everybody should be aspiring to own their own home, that really this was the way in which housing should be delivered, and that social housing or public housing should only be a last resort for the most vulnerable and the most poor. And of course behind that was the economic and political economy perspective that viewed housing as a commodity that would be very useful as to boost economic growth. It gave business to developers, who of course we know were funding politicians, and it was seen as a way in which people could gain wealth, and this idea of spreading wealth across the population through the Thatcher idea of the trickle-down effect of wealth, that through privatization, through turning everything into a commodity. This is also part of the neoliberal ideology that basically everything becomes commercialized, everything becomes commodified, and people will get wealth in that way, economic growth will increase, and everybody benefits. But of course, we've seen the myth that is. And also what happened was, secondly, was the Irish housing market became financialized, firstly through privatization of social housing, through this encouragement by the Irish state of home ownership and mortgages, but then also through the international deregulation of finance. And particularly at a European level, the role of the euro, joining the euro, had a particular role in opening up Ireland to speculative investment from French and German banks who were looking for, at the time, areas to invest in because interest rates were really low by the European Central Bank. But of course we saw this globally, particularly in America, with the investment in property, in housing, and we had the way in which subprime mortgages were bundled together in financial packages by the financial markets, sold around the world, and then of course people suddenly, when the house prices started to reduce, people realized what they had ignored was that this was built on a completely unsustainable foundation of people constantly being able to pay ever-increasing mortgages at ever-increasing prices. And the third reason then that we have the crisis is austerity and the way in which Ireland responded to the crash, both by, as I mentioned earlier, deciding to bail out the banks through NAMA and bailing out developers and focusing on growing the property market and saving the banks rather than focusing on what the people's needs were, and as a result it drastically reduced social housing, community budgets, health services across the board. But in particular, the social housing budget was cut during the period of austerity. I have to watch my time. Thanks. What's time left? 7 minutes, perfect. Okay, great. Right, we'll speed up. So, in terms of this process of financialisation, and because essentially behind it is this theory, some of you might be familiar with the geographer David Harvey, who has done a lot of work around what has happened to capitalism since the 1970s, and understanding the way in which housing and property has played a key role in the development of the neoliberal and financial model of capitalism since the 1970s. And essentially his argument is that the gains that were made through the Keynesian period of the 1940s, 50s and 60s by workers and ordinary people through public services, taxation of wealth, that kind of proportion of the overall profit and wealth being created in the world, that the capitalists essentially decided, the neoliberals, those with wealth, decided that too much was going to the workers in public services, in taxation, and they needed to find new ways to get economic growth as well because of the crisis. And you had the emergence of the corporations, the multinationals, who wanted to find lots of new products, and you had the deregulation of finance, the creation of new financial markets, all looking for new ways in which to commodify everything, to turn everything into a commercial entity, product that could be traded, profited from. And housing was one of the key areas that potentially offered significant returns because people were paying a lower percentage on their housing than what they could be. This is essentially what happened. And so we see in Ireland over time, the percentage of people's income that they're spending on housing has significantly increased. And that's not because the quality of housing has massively increased or they have more housing, but it's because that cost has increased. Where has that cost gone to? It's gone to profits. It's gone to profits for the big financial markets. We see now in Ireland we've more billionaires than we ever had. The likes of Dennis O'Brien, other big billionaires have made huge profits from the property speculation and the boom in the financial markets. We also then see as part of this process the indebtedness, this huge indebtedness on people to try and be able to pay for what should be a basic need. I'll go on. We are in a situation in Ireland where things are changing. The biggest change is that we can see in the 1960s, 20% of our housing was local authority social housing. We were a lot poorer than we are today. There was a lot less wealth in the country, yet we had 1/5 of our housing was local authority housing we were able to provide. It's now less than 10%, and we wonder why we have a crisis. The owner occupation is now down to 70%, and the private rented sector is now 20% of all tenures. The private rented sector has increased from 8% in 1991. So the private rented sector has become a key market, and in that is a lot of vulnerable people and lower income people in that sector. And that is an area that requires focus. This is inspired by Davy Phillips, who's here, I know, from Cloughjordan. I remember he mentioned it. He said that the origins of the word mortgage was, it was meant death, and debt grip was the phrase used. And I went and looked it up, and I saw, actually, the mortgage comes from the Old French, which means debt, and the gage means pledge. So mortgage is a pledge till your death. And I think this is what we need to be having a discussion about. Why do we have these mortgages that essentially force us into contracts till our death, when we could be, in actual fact, who is benefiting from it? It's banks, developers, speculators, not ordinary people. This is also, I'll move on. In terms of the impact of austerity around social housing, we see here the dark blue line, the dark blue on the bottom is the reduction in social housing. I've calculated that if Ireland had maintained spending on social housing at the level it was doing in 2008, we would have an additional 25,000 social housing units now in Ireland, which would certainly solve the housing crisis. So when the argument is made that austerity worked in Ireland, it didn't work. Austerity created the housing crisis that we're in now. The government has outlined a Housing 2020 strategy to address housing. I would argue that while there's a welcome return to investment in public housing, that it is actually very dangerous and disingenuous to suggest that this policy is going to in any way address the housing crisis. It continues the policy of privatisation, relying on the private rented sector to deliver housing. And only 1/5 of the housing that's going to be delivered under this strategy will be new local authority or public housing. There is a myth at the heart of it, and there's a problem at the heart of it, that it will actually deliver and address the housing need. We are, I would argue, the NAMA Republic rather than an actual real republic. NAMA, of course, was set up to take the toxic loans off the banks and basically do a process of trying to sell them off, make money for the taxpayer. But what has happened is that NAMA has now got caught up in the political, the run into the next election, and there's this idea by policymakers that NAMA selling off all its properties, NAMA engaging in property speculation and development is a good thing, and that if we get back all this money from NAMA quickly, that is a positive thing. It's not. NAMA is part of the reason why rents are escalating. NAMA is selling our property internationally on the basis of rising rents. So we're locking ourselves into this rising rents because we think we're getting rid of the toxic loans. We are in the process of being recolonized by international financial property speculators, and we are doing it to ourselves through a state-led, controlled agency called NAMA. NAMA has 3 billion euros to invest in property and residential accommodation. It's going to do it over the next 3 years. What's it going to invest in? Offices, because that's what we need. We need offices when people are living in cars, tents, we have 1,000 children on the streets, 1,000 children. We have our local authorities who are now in the process, again it was spoken at last night in Kildare, of doing public-private partnerships, which were shown to be an absolute failure. Again, because they've no money, they're now going to rent their land, engage with developers, to give their public land that they have. Kildare, for example, has 250 acres of public land, council-owned land, that it could build local authority housing on. It doesn't have the money. The government isn't giving it the money to do it, because the government is deciding to give it away in tax breaks in the coming election, because that's what we need, more tax breaks. That there's this land that exists in Dublin as well. They're advertising it to international property investors to build social housing, which the council will rent back off them. Again, pumping money into the private for-profit sector. The Glass Bottle site is down in the bottom left, is a NAMA-owned site. This is a site in the Docklands where most of the money that 3 billion is going to go into. And the question is, why is NAMA being allowed to put that 3 billion into there when it should be investing in building social housing? We own it. It's a state body. And the similar question should be asked about the AIB Bank. Why are we selling that bank when we could be using it to completely change how Ireland works, supporting investment in indigenous industry, supporting cooperatives, the development of cooperative housing. We have this, and the Irish people need to realise we actually have these things at our disposal if we change how we're using them. But the current trajectory of policymakers is all about neoliberalism, financialisation, property markets, the wealthy. It's not about, I would argue, meeting the need, and particularly the need of housing in communities. This is the rate of possessions. My time now is time up. Okay, I'll finish up. This is the democratic programme of the first Dáil in 1919 in Ireland. It captures what, when our republic was founded, the proclamation was made in 1916, what the ideas and vision of those people, Padraig Pearse, James Connolly, and those, what type of republic they were envisioning. I'll read from the key part of it. It's up the top. It says there that the nation, they talk about that in the language of our first president, Padraig MacPearse, we declare that the nation's sovereignty extends not only to all men and women of the nation, but to all its material possessions. And they go on to say the key thing, that all wealth-producing processes within the nation, and with him we reaffirm that all right to private property must be subordinated to the public right and welfare. They go on to say that the Republic should be governed according to the principles of liberty, equality and justice, and it shall be the first duty of the government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter. Our government is not prioritising that. It is not prioritising its people. That's why I would argue that we need to refound our republic and create a new republic based on those original principles. That is our task. Lots of people are involved in this. Just to say quickly, these are images from the two republics, the two Irelands that exist. Top left is Darndale. It says, welcome to Darndale, the edge of nowhere, as seen in TV3. Some of you might have seen the Estate TV programme. The bottom left is Moyross. The top right, Fox Rock. The bottom right, the Beacon Hospital. This is the new Ireland that has emerged. I would argue the potential for a new republic. People are standing up and saying, this is not the type of country we want. It has come through the water movement, but there's a lot more emerging. People are starting to address the housing crisis. We've got alternatives being developed, like yourselves in terms of Nimble spaces, looking at alternatives, cooperatives, values. There's the election coming up. I believe that we're actually on the cusp of people realising that the way in which Ireland, the Republic, has been run since independence is not the type of Ireland that benefits its people. Housing is at the core of that. And if we are to make housing a right, we have to make it something that is available to everybody, and we have to prioritise it as a public good, like what health should be, like what education should be. But the only way that will happen is if we challenge the political establishment, the ideology, the narrative, and engage in changing it. Thank you.